Hello, I am Fullmaster, and I will be doing a short guide about Arcane Mages, ranging from the most basic to some of the more complex aspects. I will cover your stat priorities, talk about gear with emphasis on trinkets, explain how to utilize your procs/use items to the fullest, give you a general rundown of mastery/mana usage, and a few other things I feel are important. Before I continue, everyone's gear and stat priorities will vary based on their gear level, their race, their raid comp, and their other trinkets. What I say here is a general outline you'll want to follow 90% of the time and what works for me. If you have multiple spreadsheets that show why I'm wrong, then this video probably is not for you. First, we have your stat priorities. If you have T12 or any combination of the gear that is not 4-piece T11, then it is the following. Int, followed by hit to 17%, which is cap, followed by spell power, followed by haste to the soft cap, which is 1768, followed by mastery, followed by crit, and then followed by haste if you're at the soft cap. If you're using 4-piece T11, then it's the same, except that you avoid haste like it's 8. Transitioning to gear, as I mentioned a moment ago about how you might be between T11 and T12, it's important to note when you can swap over. Some mages, through no fault of their own, by reading a misinformed post or otherwise, are wearing eye level 359 4-piece T11, while waiting to have 4-piece T12 with some 391 tier. Waiting only applies if you had eye level 372 tier. As far as your other gear goes, Firelands doesn't really give you more than one option for most of your slots, so we'll just focus on trinkets. Namely, Moonwell Chalice, Variable Pulse Lightning Capacitor, Hard Mode Thralian's Mirror, Rune of Zeth, and Shard of Woe. Going in order of what you'd want to use, first we have Shard of Woe. It's the largest DPS gain you can get out of a trinket slot currently, and it has the largest impact on your playstyle. Even with no static stats, the sheer number of extra arcane blasts you can get off without arcane missiling makes it amazingly valuable. Though on fights with a lot of AoE or movement, aka Rylith, it does lose some of its value. Second, we have the Variable Pulse Lightning Capacitor. Between already having a large amount of static int and its damage recently being buffed, whether you have normal or heroic, it's a clear victor for that second trinket slot. The only time you might want to consider discarding this beauty is if your guild needs more burst during a specific part of a fight, and an unused trinket would help that. Third, the Moonwell Chalice. Static int, unused mastery, easy to obtain, it's a great trinket for any mage. Last we have Rune of Zeth and Heroic Thralian's Mirror, if you got it last year. They're last together because they're about equal. The mirror has a lot of static int and a massive mastery proc. The downside is it has a terrible 10% proc chance, which makes your DPS very RNG based. The best you can do is save Flame Orb for it, right before AP, and use it to increase your chances of having the proc up for your burn. While Rune of Zeth has no static int, its 1 minute CD with an int use still makes it very powerful. It lets you pair it with a variety of things based on the situation. Be it mana gem, AP burn, mirror proc if it's the other trinket for a mini burn, or the last few seconds of it with Evocate, which we'll get to later. If you don't have Shard of Woe and you have to use 2 other trinkets, I personally prefer 2 static int trinkets, as it makes your overall spell usage more forgiving and feels better. If you don't have Shard, that doesn't mean you can't compete with other mages that do, however. My 25-man hard mode top Arcane Mage parse of 45k for Shanix was done with Chalice rather than Shard due to forgetting to swap it back on. On to the last section, covering general gameplay, CD usage, proc information, and some profession notes. Gameplay. Arcane's baseline idea is to press Arcane Blast. A lot. Anyone can roll a mage and do relatively good damage for the first minute of a fight. When, why, and for how long you cast Arcane Blast are the things that separate a master and the fruit loop in your Buried and Hold group doing 15k at the end of the fight. The idea behind Arcane's mastery, and thus your playstyle, is that you deal more damage based on how much mana you have by percent. Chaincasting Arcane Blast regardless of your mana is the highest DPS you can do, but not sustainable at the least. After your initial burn of chaincasting Arcane Blast and evocating back up, which we'll get to at what percent you should do that later, you'll want to hover in the 85 to 95% mana zone, releasing your Arcane Blast stacks when appropriate, and being careful never to waste mage armor ticks. It's acceptable and also advisable to deviate from that at times. If, for example, Thralian's Mirror and Power Torrent proc at the same time, you'd want to chain cast longer and dump more of your mana into your DPS during this time, netting you higher overall DPS, so you can regen later. When doing this, you need to find balance. You can't go 30 seconds straight of chain casting and have 10% mana when you're done, with another minute left on Evocate. You need to figure out, for you, what amount of mana you can dump while still being able to climb back to your happy 85 to 95% zone without much hassle. Cooldown tips. Arcane Power. If you have 4-piece T12, to make the most of it, you'll want to use this on CD. The only time you want to hold off is if some other CD is coming up in very short order that you can pair it with. If you don't have your 4-piece yet, though, waiting longer and attempting to always pair it with something generally yields better results. Flame Orb. While not jaw-dropping damage, for 1 GCD it's not bad. There's many uses it has for Arcane. You can use it before AP so that another spell is benefiting from AP's buff while not having to be cast during it. You can use it to increase your proc chance of Thralian's Mirror during a burn. You can use it to buy some time to regen extra mana if you've made a mistake. Or what I prefer to do is save it for when you know you have to move, as long as your movement lines up with the general time it's going to be off CD. Evocation. The idea is that after you use your first Evocate, this is always on CD from then on. This means when you're, say, 30 seconds away from being able to use it again, you want to begin your burn, so that when it's ready, you're able to use it. At what % mana you Evocate varies in your gear and how you're going to do it. As a standard value, you'd want to aim for around 33%, so that mage armor ticks during it don't push you past 100. You can go even lower if you're planning to use Power Torrent, NG Gloves, or Rune of Zeth to enhance it, as Evocate gives back mana based on what your current max is. Last, before I show you a clip to demonstrate some of what I've talked about, profession notes. Tailoring is your first choice, as it helps you with your initial burns, gives you more of an intellect value overall, and you can pair it with tons of things during the course of the fight. This is where I ask you not to armory me and find out that I have alchemy. Your second profession can be anything you like, other than gathering professions. Jewel crafting if you want that shiny extra 1 intellect compared to the others. I do, however, highly advise you use engineering as your second, even though it does require some extra micromanaging. The 1-minute CD on the Int Gloves line up perfectly with Mana Gem, or any other CDs if the situation suits them better. Not only that, but you have access to the Global Thermal Sapper Charge. It's an item that deals AoE fire damage to enemies around you and to yourself. Using Mage Ward before the pull, and using this during AP, is more useful than you'd think. The crit chance is based off your spell crit, which is higher because of pots etc. in the beginning, and the damage increased by buffs like Arcane Power. When lucky, I've gotten upwards of 1,000 spell power during my initial burn. You can use it twice on long fights. For an example of doing this, and enhancing Evocate, we'll look at Alpha's first kill of Hard Mode Balrog. You can see the charge used here, and know that it was definitely aiding in those large crits. We'll fast forward a bit here. I'm burning down 40% mana, I know Power Torrent will proc shortly, and I want to use the last second of Shard to haste my Evocate. I use Shard. Using the last second of it, I Evo. And Power Torrent procs. Even though after I evocated back up and started burning a little more because I had tricks, when Power Torrent falls off, you can see I'm still at 85%. If you can't do it in your head, or you don't already have something that tracks your ICDs/procs, getting something like Forte or similar would be helpful for you. Even though specking is pretty straightforward, if you're having trouble, you can always look up my armory here. I'll always have a PvE Arcane spec. That's it for my short guide. I've covered most things you should know without spending 10 years on every little aspect. I hope you've enjoyed watching this and that I might have helped some of you. Please subscribe.